Today we're going to talk about the history of the SiClone. So yes, the SiClone. This was our first pedal that we brought out under the Zander name, and it was actually one that had kind of its first beginnings before Zander even existed. So I thought it was worth doing a little video about it, because over the last few years it's had quite a few different variations and iterations and mods and changes that we've made to the circuit, to the point where it's not even really that similar to the first one or the thing that it's based on. So I figured a little video just to kind of go into the details of the different variations and why we changed certain things would be helpful. So irritatingly, I actually don't have the very first unbranded version of the SiClone that we made and sold before Zander started, but I'll try and find a picture, and I'll throw it up on the screen now so you can have a look. So it basically started life, or the concept behind the SiClone started life as trying to make a fuzz factory, but with all silicon transistors, just because they're easier to find and they're more stable and they're cheaper, and they just don't come with all the kind of drawbacks that a lot of germanium ones do. So, and this was before Zvex had brought out their silicon version as well. So at the time there was kind of a gap for it, for what we initially wanted to do, which was basically kind of a straight up clone, because that's where it came from in the beginning with it was like one of the first circuits that I kind of learned to mess about with. So very much at the beginning, especially before Zander started, it was kind of a straight clone, and it was exciting to me because if you look at the schematic of a fuzz factory, it's basically a fuzz face circuit that's then been kind of tweaked and messed about with, so that a lot of the components are variable, and that's where you get these kind of crazy oscillations and octave things going on. That's kind of how that's generated, basically kind of by breaking the circuit. So that my idea was to take that circuit, let's just try and shove in some different transistors and see what happens. And it's a fairly robust circuit. You can kind of put a lot of things in it and you'll get like a decent sound out the end. It needed a few tweaks, and that was kind of kind of how I learned, by just mucking about with things until I got them sounding how I wanted. So the first version of the SiClone was pretty much a straight fuzz factory clone with all silicon transistors, and then also the thing that I'd learned, and I mentioned this in the video on the history of Zander circuitry in one of the previous Storytime episodes, I'd built these feedback looper pedals. So they were true bypass pedals with a feedback loop. I took that feedback loop and put it into this first version of the SiClone, and all that was basically a momentary switch connected to a pot that ran the output back into the input. And in a lot of pedals, what that does is create kind of crazy glitchy oscillations and whines and stuff. So like any kind of standard distortion or overdrive, you might get some weird like rumbly kind of oscillations. But in this circuit, what it actually does is go the other way. So it takes that kind of crazy circuit, and for the most part, depending on where you've set it, for the most part it actually kind of kills that craziness and turns it back into like more of a standard kind of fuzz sound. It was useful and quite cool, but it didn't really offer that much. And the more as I kind of went on learning about things, I wanted to like change things up a little bit more, and I moved away from the feedback looper stuff, which is where the first Zander version comes into play. So this first version that was made under Zander, we added in a tone stack. I'm not sure, there might be a few unbranded ones that had the tone stack in, but I definitely remember some ones, very, very early ones that didn't. But we basically took the tone stack from the Big Muff circuit and put that at the end of a Fuzz Factory circuit. So that's kind of where the origins of the tone control came from. There we put in a switch as well that switched between, like a toggle switch that switched between two capacitors in the tone stack. So similar to what a lot of guys do with the Big Muff circuit, is that you can just switch one capacitor and it changes the mid scoops. You can kind of flatten it out or boost the mids slightly. So we put that in there, and that added so much variety to the sound, because it allows you to kind of switch between like a really kind of scoopy sound and then like the more traditional straight Fuzz Factory sound and whatever. So it added in so much versatility, and that was really useful. And that was me kind of learning about how tone stacks work and how different circuits interact with each other and things like that. And then the other thing we added in, which was foot switchable, was a fat switch. So it switched two capacitors out, and it basically just lets a load more low end through. So great for bass, great for like super fat sounds, or if you want to like fatten up a Strat or a single coil, sounds really good. And that was foot switchable, but again, for the most part, was pretty much a Fuzz Factory clone, because again, at the beginning it was very much, we didn't even have any basic building blocks of knowledge, so it was just a case of let's just clone this and see what it sounds like. And we've tried to slowly move away from that, and you'll see as we go through the variations how we've tried to move away from the source material quite drastically. Which brings us nicely on to the third variation of the SiClone, which was put into a nice printed case. So this was the first lot of powder coated and printed enclosures that we ever had made. Up until that point, all the SiClones and well every other pedal was also just a vinyl sticker that was slapped onto a plain enclosure. Sometimes there's a period where we would clear coat them, but then we found that after a while the clear coat actually scratches off. It doesn't stick very well to the vinyl sticker and didn't really do anything other than just make a very glossy finish that was very easily scratched off. So we stopped doing that. But yeah, so these were the first batch of UV printed enclosures, and I would say the first step to us making slightly more professional pedals, for lack of a better word, because this is also when we moved away from building stuff on tag board and Vero board and into circuit boards. So these are properly designed PCBs. These were our first batch of pedals that used circuit boards. And this is where you'll start to see some of what is the current version of the SiClone. You'll start to see some of those elements come in. So tone stack is still there, and so is the mid switch, but what we did here was move that fat foot switch onto another toggle and then add in a secondary foot switch that bypassed the tone stack altogether, so you can get that original fuzz sound but also step on the switch and you get it going through the tone stack. And inside there was a trim pot, so you could adjust the level between the two and how much of a jump or a cut you wanted between the two sounds and whatever way you wanted to use it. So that was kind of the next step in what we were trying to do. Is instead of just smashing two circuits together, it was like, how do they interact? How do we then see how we can then pull them apart, and what's the best way for them to switch in and out differently, and what's the best way for the user to get to them? Is it by a toggle or is it by a foot switch? What are people realistically going to want to step between? And that was the thing, we didn't think the fat switch on the previous version was actually that useful. It was kind of one of those things where you probably just set and forget and use it either way. You wouldn't necessarily switch between two, but with the tone stack that effectively gives you two very different fuzz sounds, because you're changing not only the mid-range characteristics and the EQ in general, but also putting the fuzz through another circuit also affects the, I mean, you stack any two pedals together and you'll hear how different the one after makes the first one sound. And around the same kind of time, this brings on this weird, I wouldn't even say interim version, because it was sold at the same time as this first powder coated one, and that is the Elements series SiClone. So this was us attempting to kind of go back to the roots and offer a more affordable, even though the pedals we sell now, I mean, they're not, for a smaller company, they're not kind of crazy money, but we were very aware that a lot of people don't necessarily have 130, 150 quid. So we wanted to bring something out that was easier for us to make, something that was quick, kind of no frills, and that's where the Elements series came from. So the SiClone wasn't the only one in that series. I think we put near enough all of the pedals we had out at the time into versions like this, so with the Warbler, Shake and Tremble, part of the Avalanche, Cafetiere, all just very stripped down versions in plain boxes. They weren't even particularly well finished plain boxes, they were pretty cheapest of the cheap ones that we could find, so they had like scratches and dents, they weren't like perfectly cast or anything like that. It was really just trying to keep costs as low as possible. We printed a clear vinyl graphic. It's the same thing we actually use for prototyping, so it's just like A4 clear vinyl sticker paper that goes through a regular printer. It's not waterproof at all. If you spill water on the graphic, it's gonna smudge straight off. I think we listed them, I mean, really cheap. It was just a way of us trying to offer something else out, but it didn't really go down that well. Not that it was badly received, it's just that I don't think it wasn't really received at all. We had a small following at the time and we sold a few, so if you've got one of these Elements SiClones, I mean, you've probably got one of maybe about 5, if that, so they're pretty rare. For us, after a while, it became obvious that it was actually a step backwards, because where we were stripping things out, we were kind of moving back to just making straight clones, and that's quite boring. And the thing that I'm keen on doing is, like, where we have pedals based on other things, I don't want to necessarily be detracting from the people who made it originally. Obviously, if I want to at least try and bring something new to the table, maybe overcome an issue that it had, or a certain gripe that a lot of people have with it, or whatever, for whatever reason. The last thing I want to do is just make part for part clones of the same circuit that already exists, because it brings nothing, and I find a lot of that quite, I don't know, it's just not really us, and I don't really necessarily agree with it. I think if you're gonna bring out something that's inspired by something else, you should at least put the effort in to try and change it as much as possible and add in some variation or a different flavour or whatever. Part for part cloning is pretty boring, and it's not really what we wanted to do. So that brings us on quite nicely to the rebrand that happened at the very beginning of 2018, and this is probably the SiClone you'll see that most of you guys will know the SiClone to look like. So in early 2018 we decided to rebrand everything, the whole lineup, into a more consistent look, so taking inspiration from brands like Earthquaker and Caroline Guitar Company, and who else? Loads. There's loads out there. So Native Audio, who were known as Red House Electronics before, I think. A lot of companies do this where they have very consistent graphics and typography and whatever, and that was one of the things that we wanted to do, was have a more consistent branding element to the company, because before the graphics were cool, but they all had very different looks, and it just something wasn't gelling that well. Nothing was really that cohesive. So I think it was important for us, especially as a small brand, to create some kind of brand recognition around what we were doing. So that's where this rebrand of the SiClone came from. And with this rebrand came a few more changes. So what I've been consciously trying to do with this version is move away from toggle switches, just because they seem to be quite a high point of failure for a lot of people, either because they get kicked off, or just because we just kept finding that wherever we were buying them from, we were just getting duds and fails and whatever. And also a lot of the time it means you have to do more off-board wiring and stuff, so we were trying to move away from that, and that's kind of where I discovered that you could put a lot of things on to potentiometers and sweep between them. So that's where a lot of these changes on this version of the SiClone came from. So where we had the fat and mid switch before on the previous versions, you've now got the body and punch controls on this new version. What that does is it takes the caps that we were switching between 4 and puts them on either end of a potentiometer, and what you can do then is you can sweep between them. It requires a little bit of trial and error. Obviously, where you're adding a variable resistor, which is what a potentiometer is, into a circuit, that can also have an effect on how that circuit sounds and reacts, so it can be a little bit of trial and error in terms of finding the right value pot to use. Sometimes it's a really high value, sometimes it's a really low one, and then other times it's somewhere in the middle. So it really is just kind of, for us anyway, it was just kind of mucking about until we found one that worked really well. New vertical format, which was a big thing that we kept getting feedback on our original ones, that our original format pedals, all of them were landscape, which kept the foot switches further apart, but we realised was also a bit of an awkward form factor for a lot of pedal boards. So we switched to that portrait mode, still kept the top jacks, because that was one thing that people really did love, was the fact that we were using top jacks rather than side jack. And this version is also where we started to pull away from making like more straight up versions of like a fuzz face, fuzz factory based effect, and started changing the values of resistors and capacitors, and almost, you know, reworking the entire circuit to work with new transistors that we picked. And the more we, again, this is kind of where we learned more about biasing transistors properly and things like that. So that was where a lot of the changes in this version come from. So it's kind of completely revoiced and sounds very different to the earlier versions. And this version went down really well. It was very well received as we were growing our kind of base of followers and customers. People really seemed to love this new design and the new form factor and the way it sounded, and it's when we tried to kind of step up our production value on videos, which we're still trying to do now. And it was just such a giant step up for us, moving from those earlier versions into this like new phase of Zander. And speaking of new phases, that actually kind of brings us on quite nicely to this, what I'm hoping will be the final form of the SiClone. So it's the one that we've only recently uploaded a demo on. It's the new 125B format that we're moving all the fuzzes and drives down to over these few months. And depending on when you see this, the SiClone is probably either about to be released or has already been released. So it shares a lot of similarities with the previous larger version. The obvious differences here are the smaller enclosure and the fact that we've kind of almost inverted the artwork. So instead of a black powder coated enclosure with a white print, we've got a plain aluminium enclosure with a single colour black print, and then also matching black knobs, the custom ones that we have made. If you haven't seen the first Storytime episode about how the DIY community saved us, that's all to do with how we got these knobs made and the nightmare surrounding that, but really happy with how they look now. So that was another big thing for us, was trying to create that move away from the generic off the shelf, obviously for us, because we're trying to put 8 controls in such a small enclosure, that obviously limits what you can do somewhat, and really it kind of limits what you can buy when you're talking about off the shelf things, because it limits you to maybe 2 or 3 options, and none of them we really liked, and they kind of just looked generic. So we wanted to try and come up with something that was a little bit nicer and looked very uniquely us. So that's where the knobs came from. So again, the circuit's gone through a bit of a revoicing, so you'll find that the body and punch controls work very differently, as does the bright knob, which is the tone stack. Completely different transistors again, as well as some other changes in the rest of the circuit, so it really is entirely its own beast. And then on top of that, we've also got soft digital switching, so the circuit is still analog, but we've got soft relay switching, so where that works either latching or momentary, so you can switch between them. And then the big thing that is a change, that's going to be a change for all of the pedals going forward, is that you can reach the secondary foot switch from bypass, so you don't have to have the main engage switch on for it to work, which I know was a huge point of contention and confusion for a lot of users. When they'd see our stuff at shows or whatever, they'd press the secondary switch and wonder why the sound hadn't changed, and it's because it was kind of looped in to the wider circuit, looped within the bypass switch. But with digital switching you can kind of move away from that, and it just offers so much more flexibility, and also you don't get any clicking or anything like that when you stamp on the pedal, which you can get, especially with fuzzes and drives. That can be a thing that happens. It's such a nice step up from us moving into more of that kind of premium feel, moving into more of a production feel, if that makes sense. Not that we're not still hand making a lot of the stuff, and we are still obviously building most of the pedal by hand, but it just, this stuff, adding in this functionality, just makes it feel like more of a produced pedal rather than something that's kind of just been thrown together quickly with a soldering iron. And that, I think, is pretty much it. I really hope you guys have enjoyed this dive into the many variations of the SiClone and over the years. So let us know what you think. Hopefully you guys are really excited about the new version that's coming out soon. So yeah, let us know. Really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much as always for watching. Really appreciate you guys engaging with our content. Please like, comment and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Really appreciate it. As always, please don't forget to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and we'll see you next time.